right, good morning. Welcome to Sunday school class, the adult Bible class. We're taking a couple week break from church history, and we're taking a closer look at Christmas history. This week we'll be talking about overall the history of Christmas. Next week we're going to be looking at a video about who the real Saint Nicholas was. And that is prepared by Vision Videos. So we will talk about that. So kind of the theme of this history is that there's a question that we address and we kind of think about that sets the context. And today is, how did the birth of Jesus, recorded, of course, in Scripture as an actual historical event, turn into this holiday that we call Christmas today? How did that happen? And I just put a little quote here from Luke. And while they were there, the time came for her, Mary, to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. And we'll talk about whether the word inn is really the right word there or not. It is a traditional word. If you've been following along at home or in person, you'll know that we finally finished up with Augustine, and we did not really get too much into Pelagius, but we're going to talk about that a lot more as after the Christmas season is over, we pick back up and begin to look into how the church divided between the western side and the eastern side. And this really happened right at this kind of 450s to 480s time, culminating in what we call the Great Schism in 1081. So we'll kind of briefly run down the resources that I looked at, and I would recommend to you if you want to investigate this further, and then we'll pray and we'll get into the lesson proper. Sound fair? Everybody excited? Everybody love Christmas? I do not want to ruin Christmas for you or for your loved ones, especially for your children. So parents, if you're live streaming this is the adult Bible class for Christmas and the history of Christmas. This is me, giving you the sign here. I kind of feel like at the end of this class, those of you who love Christmas for the, Christian tone behind it might also feel like I've stolen Christmas from you. That's not my purpose either. When, I was ordained, I took a vow to tell the truth as best I know it, whether we like the truth or don't like the truth, it's still the truth. And so there it is. There you go. One other point of clarification before I get into the resources. When we talk about Christmas, English speakers, we talk about two different things. We talk about the season, which is the holiday of lights and carols and feasting and family and presents. We also talk about the birth narrative of the person who is Jesus and the kind of the values and morals that come out of that. Those are not necessarily the same things. So as we look at the history of Christmas, I'm going to do my best to make sure you understand whether I'm talking about the festival, right, the trappings of culture, or whether we're talking about the Christian meaning of Christ coming incarnate into the world. So we use the same word. Because of that, the water gets a little bit muddied, and what I'm saying, I will hopefully make more sense toward the end of our class today. All right. A wide variety of resources I looked at. I think I read 10 books this week going through this and watched 5 hours of video about it, trying to find credible resources. There's all manner of wild ideas about, how this holiday came to be. Some going back to even worshiping Nimrod and Tammuz and Timrah, and none of those things I could find any credible reference to. You may have heard that Christmas has this pagan background, and that gets really exaggerated. So I do not present incredulous resources to you. Everybody has, qualifications. Everybody is vetted through a Christian perspective or, World Institute if we're not presenting a Christian idea. So, I don't endorse the way out there's, if you will. Bernd, Brunner, and Benjamin Smith, inventing the Christmas tree. This was actually pretty interesting because it really gave a background about how the festivities and the Yuletide, mistletoe, holly, I can't even think of all the other stuff we decorate with Christmas, poinsettia, where that all came from. So this really focused on the secular holiday stuff. Christmas, its origin and associations, together with its historical events and festive celebrations during a lot of good, you see illustrated, a lot of really good illustrations. It's also free for you. You can get that online for free. The Christmas traditions with the Saturday Evening Post. I have several illustrations. I put lots of pictures in today's lesson. So that's really excellent. This guy, Bruce David Forbes, is the professor of religious studies at Morningside College in Sioux City, Iowa. He did get his PhD at Princeton Theological Cemetery. It ought to be a cemetery today for as liberal as they've gone. Also got a master's in theology from Perkins School of Theology. His outline of the history of Christmas is primarily what I will be following. So if you're going to read one book, this is the book. It's pretty short, 170 pages, big print. No pictures. Well, no, there's a whole chapter of illustrations. I take it back. Paul Frodsham, From Stonehenge to Santa Claus, The Evolution of Christmas. He is not a Christian writer, but he does give the exact same historical narrative as everybody else, which really confirms this is what actually happened. Dickens and Christmas, that talks about the British influence and the literary influence on what we know as the holiday today. Hark, the Biography of Christmas. Paul Carenza, basically you're reading reruns of the same books. Helen Leach, 12 Cakes of Christmas. I was actually going to prepare, sometimes when you look at art and paintings, you can recognize where in history, where in the cultural influence that art came from. What were people thinking at the time? Well, you can do the same thing, interestingly, by looking at the recipes I have found. And so I actually found, I was going to make the figgy pudding, but it's disgusting, and I wasn't going to put you guys through that. But if you want to do it, the recipe is in there. You totally can do it. Don't bring me any. Christmas, a very peculiar history. This Fiona MacDonald has a really excellent sense of humor. So if you'd like to read kind of an amusing tale about the history of Christmas, that's the one. And then Christmas in America history. This one more specifically looks at American audio video resources. This is the movie we're going to watch next week by Vision Video about the real story of St. Nicholas. And the rest of these are pretty good too. The two from the History Channel, they're interesting. They basically tell the exact same story. Fire of Learning is a more Christian-oriented source, so you do get that. So let's pray. We'll talk about what we'll talk about, and Lord willing, you will love Christmas at the end of this. Father, thank you for the history of your people moving in the world. Thank you for becoming one of us by taking on human flesh that we might be redeemed to you. Father, give us the clarity of mind, the opportunity to speak into the minds and the hearts of people through this celebration that we recognize today. Father, that we might honor you in all we do. And I ask today that this study of history regarding this holiday would give us insight in how to approach our world and really how to speak into the lives of those whom you've put into our path. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So you can see we've got, actually I should have deleted summary of development because we're not going to have time for that. Early Christian holidays. We're going to take a look at a little bit of myth busting about things that kind of get talked about as if they happened during the birth narrative, but they're not actually in the Bible. Adding to tradition, we're going to take a look at how Christmas is like a snowball, right? When you're building a snowman, you start with one little snowball and you start rolling it around, and it gets big and it picks up twigs and leaves, and some things get dropped off while you're going, and eventually you've got this thing that's much bigger than it started with, and it has other stuff added to it. We're going to take a look at the Reformation, Martin Luther, John Calvin, the Puritans in England, including the Pilgrims, who were separatist Puritans, and what their view of Christmas was and why that matters to us as Americans. And then the, quote, restoration of, quote, Christmas. So, first thing, and actually, could I get, I might be able to do it here. Hold on. Notes, they're on. Excellent. But where are the notes? All right. No worries. So, early Christians, we're talking, 30-something AD, death of Christ, resurrection of Christ, early church, moving forward. Birthdays were not a thing which were a part of the celebration for anybody. People just didn't recognize their birth date as a holiday. And this is kind of surprising, I think, to some of us, because we really celebrate birthdays. But it wasn't just that they didn't celebrate birthdays, they actually had a negative view of birthdays. Origen, an early Christian theologian, wrote some pretty interesting things about birthdays. He pointed to the biblical account in Genesis 40 about Pharaoh. And what did Pharaoh have happen on his birthday in Genesis 40? He killed the chief baker. And he pointed to Herod beheading John the Baptist on his birthday celebration. And Origen further went on to say, not only do not one from all the saints is found to have celebrated a festive day or a great feast on the day of his birth. No one is found to have had joy on the day of the birth of his son or daughter. Only sinners rejoice over this kind of birthday. He continues writing about the saints. Not only do they not celebrate a festival on their birthdays, but filled with the Holy Spirit, they curse that day. He referred to Jeremiah. Cursed be the day on which I was born. Jeremiah 20:14. Similarly for Job and David. The whole discussion communicates this general attitude that was held by Christians in the first several centuries, that birthdays were pagan holidays. That, quote, the worthless man who loves things connected with birth keeps birthday festivals. And so with that attitude about birthdays, it makes sense that the birth of Christ wouldn't be recognized as a holiday. Birth was a negatively viewed thing, something that pagans did. In fact, if you notice and you read through Paul's letters, there's only one time in all of Paul's letters that Paul even references the birth of Christ, and that's in Galatians 4, verse 4, where he makes the comment about he was born of a woman, right? Meaning that he was a real human, not really calling attention to his birth. And Paul, of course, wrote most of the New Testament letters. We don't know the date of Jesus' birth. We don't know the month of Jesus' birth. We don't know the year of Jesus' birth. The only clue we get is that the shepherds were out in the fields, right, with their sheep, which indicates it probably was not a wintertime birth. It was probably the spring, summer, or fall. Yet we still celebrate Christmas in the winter, which is fairly interesting. And most people point to the fact that in the western side of the church, which is why I've got this graphic up here, this is the western side of the church. Early on in church history, Christianity was an illegal religion. They were persecuted by the Romans. They were tortured for their faith. It really culminated with a guy by the name of Diocletian. Diocletian made an empire-wide commitment to wiping out Christianity. And he was replaced by Constantine. And in 312, Constantine and Licentius, the Eastern Empire's emperor, both agreed to stop persecuting Christians and make it a legal religion. From that point forward, instead of running for their lives and being worried about whether or not they, would survive, Christianity being legal and actually supported by the Roman government began to flourish theologically. I put those words together and made a new word, flourish. There you go, my contribution to today. But because of this development, they developed along basically a geographical and cultural fault line. Over in the blue side, they spoke the Greek language. They were influenced by Eastern mystical religions. The heresies that developed out of this side had much more to do with the Trinity. How was Jesus God and man at the same time? They were really focusing on that. Whereas in the West, they spoke Latin. Latin is a much more precise language than Greek is. They could speak about the difference between the person Jesus and the being of Jesus as God and the being of Jesus as man, and still recognize him as one person. There's a theologian by the name of Tertullian who solved that 150 years before the first councils in the East here were being held to divide that. But in the West, they were much more legalistic oriented. Okay, there were heresies that developed on the coast of North Africa regarding, what to do with sinners. Well, because the East was so focused on this mysticism, how does Jesus actually God and how is he man? They began celebrating a holiday much before Christmas, like in the in the 3rd century, the 200s, that is called Epiphany. Anybody ever heard of Epiphany? As a religious holiday. What is the Epiphany? Well, it's a Greek word that means the revelation of something or the showing forth of something. And the thing that they couldn't really come down to a firm agreement on is what was the epiphany of Jesus? When did he reveal himself to humanity? Was it at his birth? Was it at his circumcision? Was it at the wedding feast of Cana where he did his first miracle? Was it when he was dedicated in the temple? Was it when he was baptized and the Father spoke from heaven and the Holy Spirit descended on him as a dove? Was it when he pronounced himself that, all these were different options that were agreed to. But what became the standard date of recognizing in the Eastern Empire was January the 6th for Epiphany. Well, January the 6th was all well and good, but in the West, they did not celebrate Epiphany. In the West, in the more Roman part of the empire over here, they had 3 kind of pagan festivals that were happening. When somebody speaks about the pagan origins of Christmas, they're not talking about the Christmas as in the birth of Christ. They're talking about the celebration holiday events, separate from the theology, separate from the meaning. Those 3 holidays were Saturnalia, the Feast of the Unconquered Sun, the Sol Invictus, and Kalends, K-A-L-E-N-D-S. That's where we get our English word calendar. There were 3 winter festivals. They had everything to do with licentiousness and gluttony and drunkenness, and they were just really out-of-control festivals that were probably natural if you think about unsaved humanity living in the darkest time of the year, right? The days are getting shorter, they're colder, the trees all look like they've completely died. It'd be super depressing, right? So they put together this festival, kind of cheer people up, right smack in the middle of that. And that seemed to be what was happening with these pagan festivals. Well, when Constantine became a Christian, and he was no longer going to celebrate those things, the people who were leaders of the culture in Rome, well, they want to be a Christian, but do we really have to give these things up? And so it sort of seems like a natural event to begin observing the birth of Christ around that same time. It was not a development where Christianity tried to baptize pagan holidays or take them away or convert them to a Christian. There's no evidence of that. But there is evidence that because Epiphany was January the 6th, the birth of Christ being celebrated on the 25th of December seems to have been a development. And how many days are between December 25th and January 6th? 12. This is where we actually get our 12 days of Christmas. It goes from the birth of Christ, supposedly, on the 25th of December to the Epiphany of Christ, whatever the Epiphany is, on the 6th of January. But of course, people, they never get along. Does it start on the 26th of December and go through the 6th of January? Or does it start on the 25th of December and go to the 5th of January? Which are the 12 days, right? And so this was something that they, continued to have disagreement about. So there we go. That is the 12 days of Christmas. I put up here the origin quotes. And by the way, these come from his homilies on Leviticus, his commentary on Matthew. And so if you wanted to go look up origin, I can give you those sources. So when is the first record that we have of Christmas being celebrated on December 25th is in 354. Before that, people argued, theologians or pastors, right, Christian bishops, argued for the birth of Jesus on March 25th, or March 28th, or April 19th, or April 20th, or May 20th, or November 18th. Those were all kind of standard days for the birth of Christ for the first 300 years of Christianity. March 25th is interesting because it actually comes from this Jewish legend that every prophet was born on the 25th of March. I don't know why they thought that, but it just happened to be. It's also I think the summer solstice or something like that, right? It's right around that time. Anyhow, so that's why March 25th. But the first record we have is 25 Decembers in 354 by something called the Philokalian Calendar. The Philokalian Calendar is like the old Farmer's Almanac. It was a list of dates, important things that happened. It's actually written in there in two places. In one place, it's written in there at the start of the list of the dates of the martyrs. So the Christian saints who died for the faith. So, and the second place is the way that they counted the calendar was by listing the two proconsuls of the Roman Empire. So think of the president. Every year there's a new president of the East and a new president of the West. They're the proconsul. And so they list their two names, and that would be the year. So in the year of 354, they go back and they actually list out when Jesus would have been born. So until 525, years were counted according to the names of the Roman proconsuls. Dionysius Exiguus, which means Dionysius the Short, suggested this new numbering system going back to, let's make year one the date of Jesus' birth. He was a monk, and he thought, naming the years after Roman proconsuls was a bad idea. Let's number the years based on the year Jesus was born. But he got the date wrong. He got the year wrong. He was off by at least 4 years. This wasn't popular from 525 until the Venerable Bede in 731 had written a history, and he used Dionysius Exiguus' years. So there's Epiphany, the earliest records, the current date by Clement of Alexandria. He advocated for the baptism of Jesus. By the 300s, the date was set. Interestingly, a bishop who grew up in Alexandria, Alexandria is a big city in Egypt, said that there was a Egyptian pagan god who is said to have been given birth from a virgin on the 6th of January, and every year that the water of the Nile would turn into wine. This is a picture. The reason I mentioned that about the Epiphany is that you can clearly see that there were borrowings from the Bible making their way into secular culture, even as early as the first few hundred years after Jesus' birth. So this is an example. Like I said, it's sort of like an old farmer's almanac. His date of birth is listed at the head of the table of Christian martyrs, and then in the dating of the Roman consuls, and I thought I had this quote in here, Christ is born during the consulate of Caesar Augustus and anybody? That guy, Aemilianus Paulus, on the 25th of December, a Friday, the 15th day of the new moon. So that's the first time we see the date of 25 December in writing. This is 354 AD. There's a very complicated scholarly argument that says some of these papers that were put into that calendar might go back to 336. But, I mean, that's 350 years after the birth of Jesus before anybody said, oh, this is 25 December. By the early 400s, the East was observing Jesus' birth. The West was recognizing January 6th. They kind of came to agreement that they should both celebrate both holidays. And in 567, there was a council in France, Tours is in France, that formally announced the 12 days between Christmas and Epiphany are to be counted as holy days. That's also the first time we see any advocate of Advent. The 4 Sundays, the 4 weeks, starting at 4 Sundays before, as kind of mini Lent. In fact, the Eastern Orthodox Church calls it Christmas Lent or mini Lent to this day. So that happened at a council in 567. Just as an interesting aside, they made some other interesting announcements at that council. A married bishop should treat his wife as a sister. That was their canon number 12. No priest or monk was to share his bed with someone else, and monks were not to have single or double cells, but were to have a common dormitory in which 2 or 3 were to take turns in staying awake and reading to the rest. So in the monastery, you had to have somebody awake at all time reading. If a monk married or had familiarity with a woman, he was to be excommunicated from the church until he returned penitent to the monastery enclosure and thereafter underwent a period of penance. No woman was to be allowed to enter the monastery enclosure, and if anyone saw a woman enter and did not immediately expel her, he was to be excommunicated. Canon 16. Married priests, deacons, and subdeacons should have their wives sleep together with the maidservants, while they themselves slept apart. And if any one of them were to be found sleeping with his wife, he was to be excommunicated for a year and reduced to a lay state. So this is sort of the development of the unmarried priesthood here in the 560s. This is also the time we start seeing things like this develop in the church, wreaths, as a symbol of Christmas, where they would put calendars in them to mark each of the Sundays. So why 25 December? I already kind of mentioned some people want to associate it with that. Probably what it was is they actually needed to have a festival. They didn't adopt or adapt or turn those ceremonies into the Christmas ceremony. They wanted to replace them. They wanted to stop celebrating them and celebrate something holy. And as I mentioned, that had to do with Constantine. So let's do a little bit of myth busting. How many of you have seen pregnant Mary riding a donkey into Bethlehem? How many of you have read that Mary rode a donkey anywhere in the Bible? Possibly Isaiah 1:3 has a donkey in it, and that's a reference to Jesus, to the Messiah. So most people think that might be the confusion about how those stories went together. It was probably natural for her and him to have been riding a donkey rather than walking the distance. There was also a very early document that was not a part of Scripture. It was not written by James. It's what they call pseudepigraphal. And because this event happened, I mean, you think about it, a guy dies by Roman execution, comes back to life. Within a couple weeks, there's thousands of people thronging more dead people are being raised from, it's like this incredible event. Well, people started writing about that, fictional accounts about that. One such fictional account is the Proto-Evangelium of James, and it has a story about Mary and Joseph riding a donkey. Actually, it has a story about Joseph's son, not from Mary, who was riding a donkey. So those are the kind of the two ideas about where did we get the idea of a donkey. Inn, this one, so the word that's used in Greek for inn is kataluma. That means a guest chamber. There is a word for a commercial room service, like a hotel in Greek. That word is pandokion. That is not the word in any manuscript of the New Testament we have. Mary and Joseph probably wouldn't have been able to afford one of those places, and because they were going to their historical home of record, by Jewish law, their family was required to take them in, free of charge. However, when it says there was no room at the guest chamber or the guest room, that probably meant they had other relatives who were also visiting who got there first. So what they did was they put them in to the house where the animals were kept in the winter time, perhaps, cool nights. But there was a place to feed oxen because they were shepherds. They were, do you travel and bring your herd of oxen with you that need to be fed at your hotel? Maybe your horse or your donkey. Probably not your bull or your cow, right? Like that wouldn't necessarily, you might have a cart, right, that you would pull with an oxen instead. But most people pulled their carts with, the guest homes and the hotels would have had a place to keep your horses and donkeys, not necessarily your oxen. So extremely unlikely they tried to purchase a room from somebody. If that's what you have in your mind, we'll keep the lights on for you, Holiday Inn or whatever. Probably not it. They probably went to a relative's home, said, can we stay here? You're required by law. They said, we're already full. But we do have the place where the animals are kept. Manger is a specific term for a feeding trough for oxen. How many magi? How many wise men? I don't know either. Bible doesn't say. It says there were 3 gifts. It says they visited well after Jesus was born. Doesn't say anything about them riding camels, but possibly that's what they did. They were coming from the east, which was all desert. So, would make sort of sense. Now, they're also not kings. We 3 kings of or it doesn't. The Bible doesn't call them Melech in Hebrew, or kings in Greek. It calls them magi, wise men, or magician is not the right word. Astrologer or astronomer, whichever one actually studies the stars, not the one that writes your horoscope. The more scientific version. So they're not called kings, but Psalm 72 talks about kings, so we think maybe that's where the story got conflated. And there's no record of camels, and again, we think possibly that came from Isaiah 60. All right, adding to tradition. I have a whole ton of notes here, so we're skimming. So if I'm losing you or it's not making sense, the point of the story so far, Christmas is very, very late. Early Christians did not celebrate birthdays. In fact, they kind of rejected the idea of having a birthday because that was something secular society did, something Pharaoh and Herod did. They killed people and did wicked things on birthdays. And you saw from the canons of the Council of Tours that even things associated with reproduction and birth were looked on dimly by the early church. They had this very ascetic view that you should deprive yourself of cleanliness and food and marital relations, and somehow that made you more holy. This, especially in the West, like I mentioned, they were very legalistic. They'd get along with a lot of folks in some places, I think, around here today. All right, so let's talk about adding to tradition. Paul, we saw in Acts 17 when he was at Mars Hill, right, the Areopagus, he appealed to this idea of an unknown God, and he used that to open a door to be able to testify to who Christ was. Augustine spoke of plundering the Egyptians. There's a really long quote I have in here, but basically what he gets to is that secular philosophical thought, if it's right, is from God, just like when the Israelites left Egypt. They got the gold of the Egyptians that the Egyptians were using for bad things, but it was still valuable. It was still gold, and they turned it into the furnishings for the tabernacle. Right? So Augustine's argument is if God can, redeem those unholy secular things as the Israelites coming out of Egypt, then we can do the same thing. So there's that long quote. Now, Gregory was a bishop of Rome. A pope. But when I say pope, I don't want you to think like today's Roman Catholic pope. There was a pope in Antioch. There was a pope in Alexandria. There was a pope in Jerusalem. There was a pope in Constantinople. All it meant was this was a big city, and the main bishop over that big city was said to be a patriarch. In Latin, papa. The popes of Rome would write to the popes of Alexandria, calling them popes. Okay, this Roman Catholic idea of the pope, although important, and I will use that term in that sense later, at this point in time in history just wasn't true. So Gregory I, Gregory the Great, gave this advice to a different Augustine, not Augustine of Hippo, but Augustine of Canterbury. Augustine of Hippo lived in the late 300s, early 400s, so clearly not that guy. This was in 601, and he wrote, "The idol temples of that race should by no means be destroyed, but only the idols in them. Take holy water, sprinkle it in these shrines, built altars, place relics in them. When this people see that their shrines are not destroyed, they will be able to banish error from their hearts and be more ready to come to the places they're familiar with, but now recognizing and worshiping the true God." This was the practice and the policy of the chief bishop of Rome. Was, hey, they're already celebrating a festival on this day. Let's just make it about Christ. And when they get there, they'll be able to banish the error from the heart, and they'll be able to celebrate Christ. This was formal policy. So let's take a look at some of these traditions that we look at. I mean, I've seen the articles written about the candy cane as a shepherd's hook, and it's striped with the blood. I encourage you to use that as a way to speak into people. I don't encourage you to think that was the actual history of the development of the candy cane. That's just historically wrong. And don't present it as if that was historically right, so that when the person you're trying to speak into discovers the truth, they realize you're lying about the history, and they think you're also lying about Christ. You see the danger? Okay. So this is the part where I steal Santa Claus from you as Christians, okay? That's not my purpose. That's not my point. I want you to enjoy your birthday, even though it's pagan and evil and wicked, right? I want you to enjoy your Christmas tree, even though it was well later on. But use it to testify to the glory of Christ, right? So, I knew I was going to be, I should have wore my Grinch sweater up here today, huh? All right, so where does the Christmas tree come from? We don't actually know. There's three good kind of origin legends about it that have some credibility, but there is a very clear precursor to the Christmas tree, which absolutely connects it to Christianity. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Bible was only available in Latin. No one spoke Latin. When you went to church, the priest would give his homily, his sermon, in Latin. No one spoke Latin. So how did you learn anything about Christianity? Well, you had stained glass walls on the windows, and the church at this time was selling something they called an indulgence, which allowed your dead relative to get out of purgatory early based on the merit of some saint. And so they made that available to you in their local language so that you would understand. And they would put on what they called mystery plays. They would, like, we're going to do a Christmas play today with the kids to tell the story of Christmas, of Jesus' birth. I'm using Christmas to refer to the actual, biblical elements, not the holiday tradition stuff. Well, they did the same thing because they couldn't read the Bible. They couldn't hear teaching and preaching in their local language. Well, and one of the things that they did is they told the story about the fall of man by putting a fir tree with apples on it, and they called it, in German, a paradise baum. To this day, Christmas trees in Bavaria are called paradise baums. That means tree of paradise, right? And Lichtstock is a wooden pyramid. Have you ever seen one of these things with the little fan blades on it and the candles underneath it, and the heat from the candles spins the very German sort of thing? That also was a very, something that happened to tell a story about the Holy Spirit and his, you can't see him working, but clearly it's happening, right? And so that pyramid wooden thing, we think, has some relation to putting candles or lighting on Christmas trees. Closest we can get to any historical actual development. But there are 3 good origin stories. Saint Benedict, in the 7th century, was a missionary priest to what we today would call Germany, Sweden, Austria area. At that time, the pagan religion celebrated Odin. Thor, Viking, Odin, right? And Odin's tree was evidently this large oak tree that had been growing, and then they said it was Odin's tree, and St. Benedict was said to have chopped down the tree with one stroke. Anybody hear George Washington and this cherry tree? Also related to that legend. And all the people thought Odin was going to strike Benedict down with a lightning bolt. Only that didn't happen. A fir tree sprouted out from the stump of the dead oak. Christmas tree. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying this is a legend that we think, has some credibility, has been told a lot for history. And also, I'm sorry, I said Benedict, it's Boniface. What's wrong with my brain? So there's another legend about a poor woodcutter in the Black Forest of Germany, or somewhere in that German area, who gets a visit from a poor orphan kid. He wakes up, and him and his wife are making their tea or whatever, and they hear this out in the front yard, and they go out, and there's this freezing, shivering baby. They take him in, and instantly he changes into the radiant Christ child, and he blesses them with a fir tree because they took care of him. Also, there's a legend about Martin Luther in one of his depressed, manic states, walking out into the forest at wintertime and seeing the beautiful stars and the breath of his, and he, sees the moonbeam shine through the thing in the forest, and there's this beautiful fir tree. So he cuts it down and brings it inside and decorates it and says, this is to testify to the glory of God. The only 3 legends I could find that have some sort of, like, why do we put trees in our homes to celebrate Christmas? What about poinsettias? You know the little plant with the red leaves that we wrap in tin foil, shiny foil? Do you know those are native to Mexico? And the red leaves are actually the leaves of the plant dying because they don't have any sunlight. You're welcome. I'm just stealing Christmas from you. You're torturing to death a plant by starving it of sunlight, and so it turns red in distress, and we think, oh, how pretty. What's that? It is pretty. Not for the plant, probably, but... So the legend of that plant was there's this poor girl that wanted to bring a gift to baby Jesus. Little drummer boy, right? Same story, only this time it's a girl. But she's got nothing to give. So she grabs a handful of weeds and she brings it, and one tear falls out of the baby Jesus' eye, and it hits the plant and turns it into this beautiful red. I don't make this stuff up. I am 100% positive. I have not nearly that creative. Well, in 1825, we had an ambassador from the United States to Mexico. His name, Dr. Joel Roberts Poinsettia. You know what his hobby was? Horticulture. Is that the right word for plant stuff? All right. And he saw this plant he'd never seen before that has this amazing ability to turn to red, and he brought it back with him. And that's why we call it the poinsettia, in honor of the U.S. ambassador to Mexico who went. And incidentally, in Mexico, they call it the flowers of the night good. Good night isn't the right word in English because that doesn't translate into the goodness of the night, right? It means go to bed, right? So that's not what it means in Spanish. So they call them, the holy flowers, basically. All right. I hate that we only speak English. All right. What about Santa Claus? Here's really going to get sad for you. St. Nicholas was a real person. He was a bishop of a real city called Smyrna. He lived in the third century, the late 200s into the early 300s. So late 3rd century, early 4th century. He has several legends around his life about giving gifts. He is also the patron saint whose feast day is the 6th of December. And interesting, let me just, I touched on it a little bit. When I use the word saint from the perspective of a Western church, Roman Catholic view, I do not mean somebody who has taken the righteousness of Christ and had it applied to them, counted toward their righteousness, as the Bible says, because of their faith in Christ by God's grace. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that person has more merits than demerits because of the way they live their life on earth. So when they die, God looks at them and balances the scales. On balance, there's more good than bad. They don't have to spend an undefined period of time in post-life burning torture, purgatory, until all of this, the negative gets paid off. They had more good than bad. This is the Roman Catholic view of salvation. Okay, so this Saint Nicholas was one of the very, very few saints whose life lived in good deeds merited him sainthood. Most other saints would not, by their life, have merited sainthood. It was by the way they died up to this point. You see the difference. He didn't die a martyr's death that they counted as, this big testimony to Christ. He actually did a whole bunch of really good things in his life. And so he's like a special kind of saint. In fact, he became the patron saint of children, fields, sailors, everything. One commentator called him the hardest working saint in history. He's he's like the James Brown of history. So, in the East, especially going up into Russia, the legend of St. Nicholas was spreading, and he became their favorite saint of the sea and the fields. In the western side of the church, by the 1100s, French nuns had been secretly delivering gifts to poor children on 6 December, St. Nicholas's Day. The Spanish, very Roman Catholic, conquered the Netherlands, Holland, right? Deutschland, Germany, right? But north of Germany, those lowlands. And when they conquered that, they brought with them their legend of, what's St. Nicholas in Dutch? I wonder where we got that name. St. Nicholas. The Dutch Sinterklaas, however, lived most of the year, not in the North Pole, but in Spain. And the weeks prior to his feast day, he would come by ship to the Netherlands and he would begin examining the children. And the good children got gifts. See, happy Sinterklaas. The bad children got visited by Zwart Piet. Remember, Spain was invaded from Africa by the Islamic invasion, the Moors, right? So the sidekick to Santa Claus in the Netherlands is a little black midget who has with him a switch to beat the bad children with. This is a photo from 2018 of Sinterklaas and Zwarte Piet in Holland. This is still today their tradition. But now he doesn't look like he's carrying a switch to beat the bad children. Worse yet, like if you were especially bad, Sinterklaas would let Zwarte Piet take you back with him to Spain, and not all the children returned. That's the legend. All right, so he'd ride over the houses, also according to legend, on a white horse, and he would deliver toys in the wooden shoes that were left out by the kids. However, in the Reformation Europe, Germany, the Alsace region of France, Geneva, Switzerland, Luther, Calvin, those guys looked at all of this veneration of Sinterklaas, St. Nicholas, and said, that's all popishry. That's not biblical. That's Roman Catholic nonsense. And we're going to abandon any following of that. And so what they did is that they moved the tradition from early December to the eve of what was celebrated as the birth of Christ. But instead of St. Nicholas, Santa Claus visiting, they had the Christ child, which in German is Christkindl. Anybody heard of Kringle? That's because it wasn't Santa Claus, it was the Christkindl, the Christ child. But see, the Germans, they're not excited about a visit from the Christkindl. They wanted Santa Claus, so they became this added mythology that somebody else would visit with the Christ child. Some of my favorites included Old Man Winter, Father Christmas, or in Italy, this little witch-like creature called Befana would come with the Christ child, and if you were a bad child, Befana would have her way with you. In Germany, they had Knecht Ruprecht, farmhand Rupert. See, he's got his discipline right there with him for the bad children. Or Berchtha. Berchtha was a shape-shifting alpine goddess. She looked beautiful or looked terrifying. She's said to have one large left foot and a regular sized, it's not big feet, right? It's big foot. So she would be the one who would discipline the bad children. Well, at the same time this is going on, what's happening in England is Henry VIII wants a divorce. He tells the Pope, the Roman Catholic bishop now at this point, that he's not going to have any part of his religion. We're going to be our own thing, right? The Anglican Church. Now, this is good news if you're actually a Christian, because you see the opportunity to turn all of this popishry back into a Christian celebration. Part of that included getting rid of Christmas, because it was this lavish saint worship, had nothing to do. We don't even know when Christ was born. So there are two groups. One was the Pilgrims. They were separatists. They went to Holland, eventually came to America, right? Pilgrims Rock, that whole thing. The other group were the Puritans, who thought they could reform the church from within. They were the primary instigators for getting a translation of the Bible that we today call the King James Bible, because James didn't want them using the Geneva Bible, which called the king a tyrant, and other things like wanting to translate baptism as immersion. Who would want to do that? The church building, instead of being a building, it was the group of people who met in the church, right? The gathered assembly. So these Puritans sought to reform it within, including getting rid of Christmas. They were very much against Christmas because it was an irreligious, popish invention. Meanwhile, in Sweden, the Calvinistic influence was being supported because of the influence of the Scottish to the north. If you know the story of John Knox and how he actually raised King James VI of Scotland, who became King James I of England, you'll know his Puritan influence. And they looked at Christmas as this time where there was all this immoral behavior. People would sit down and eat until they were full, and sometimes beyond full. That was worse than drunkenness at that time. 1642, England went into a civil war. Oliver Cromwell became the ruling authority figure. He wasn't the king anymore. The king was actually imprisoned. And they actually made it illegal to celebrate Christmas in England from 1647 until 1680. I think. Same thing about Easter, by the way. You could not legally celebrate Easter in England at this time because that also was an unchristian holiday. 1660, I said 1680. But in 1660, King George comes back, takes back over England. He restores Christmas. Yay, presents. Now, in the colonial area of America, the Pilgrims and eventually the Puritans who would join them, they absolutely suppressed celebration of Christmas, actually passing a law in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1659 that lasted until 1681. Other denominations in America that did not celebrate Christmas included the Quakers, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and the Methodists. German Lutheranism, however, Catholic light, was lenient to keeping Christmas as a holiday as long as they got rid of the more extravagant excesses. In fact, in the United States, because there were no Protestant Christians holding church services on Christmas Day, Baptists, Lutherans, Presbyterians were going to Baptists, Presbyterians, they were going to church services held by their Lutherans and their Roman Catholics to figure out what they were making up about all this Christmas time stuff, which became the only reason, as far as we can tell historically, that conservative Protestant Christians began holding services on Christmas Day, was because they were being outcompeted by the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics. 1758, Samuel Davies, president of what would become the Princeton Seminary. Sorry, I do say that as a reference, and now it's stuck in my craw. He wrote this, 1758, regarding Christmas: sinning, sexuality, luxury, and various forms of extravagance, as though men were not celebrating the birth of the holy Jesus, but of Venus or Bacchus, whose most sacred rites were mysteries of iniquity and debauchery. I do not set apart this day for public worship as though it had any peculiar sanctity, or we were under any obligation to keep it religiously. This was the opinion of conservative Christians in the late 1700s. Continuing on, Congregationalist pastor Harry Ward Beecher, you might know his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. He wrote, "To me, Christmas is a foreign day." Congress in the United States met on Christmas Day until 1855, and public schools in Massachusetts met on Christmas Day all the way until 1870, because it wasn't a holy day, it wasn't a holiday, it wasn't celebrated. The first state that made Christmas a holiday was Alabama. Go Tide, right? 1836. But there were pockets in America where Christmas was enjoyed as a holiday, primarily in the Dutch areas. Remember, I didn't mention the Dutch and the Germans for no reason. I'm trying to close the circle. They brought with them their legends of Sinterklaas. On May 17th, 1844, for example, the New York State Police Department was formed. Why? Because there had been so many riots that were happening because of the public debauchery around the Christmas time the year before, that they needed to establish a police force. So there's one way of dealing with problematic behavior, right? Christmas was this crazy time of indulgence and drunkenness and debauchery. What's another way you can do it? You can turn Christmas into a family holiday. And that's exactly what they did. They formed the New York Historical Society. So I should have put that later because I immediately switched back to England. These two things are happening at the same time. Christmas is coming back in England. Christmas is making a comeback in America. So in England, Charles Dickens writes his famous Christmas Carol, right? Scrooge is visited by three spirits of Christmas. If you read it, you'll notice he never mentions Jesus Christ. What's that? Four? All right, so clearly I'm not that much into it. Doesn't mention anything about Jesus or his birth. The only three words that have any religious connotation is that after he gets his visits, that next day, he went to church. And in fact, the bad guy, Scrooge, right? When he tells the poor guy with the little crippled kid, what's his name? No, the dad. Ratchet? Bob Cratchit. When he tells Bob Cratchit that he has to work on Christmas, it wasn't that Charles Dickens was criticizing or making a statement. He was telling you exactly how it was. in England at that time. It wasn't weird for Scrooge to expect him to work. Everybody worked. In fact, what happens on that next day is Scrooge looks at the boy out on the street and he says, you know that big chicken or whatever in the market? Go get that and deliver it to the Cratchits. Well, the market was open. Everybody knew the market was open. It wasn't unusual for things to be open on Christmas Day. What Charles Dickens was doing was he was intending to create out of whole cloth a tradition that didn't actually exist at that time, intentionally. Queen Victoria, 21 years old, marries Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Where's he from? Germany. What's popular in Germany? Christmas trees. So now the British royalty have a Christmas tree for the first time. 1848, a popular British magazine, the Illustrated London News. Notice the Christmas tree is actually on a table. It's not this full, and the toys are just little trinkets hanging on the boughs of the tree. They're not like this opulent thing underneath it. This is his princely sash. This is her royal crown. 1850 in the United States, Godey's Lady Book publishes no sash, no crown, same picture of the all-American family Christmas. Except that wasn't true. That had never been happening. They're inventing a tradition to make Christmas a family-focused, family-oriented event. I put the pictures side by side. They also took away his awesome mustache, which is too bad. All right. Now, 1891, the first Christmas tree was put up in the White House. Benjamin Harrison called it a, quote, old-fashioned Christmas tree. It was at least 40 years old at that point in America, right? I don't know what you think of as old-fashioned, but 40 years not really that much old. The first Rockefeller Center tree was put up in 1931. That's actually a picture of the first Rockefeller tree. It's about 20 feet high. Under Victorian influence, Christmas became a family-centered holiday rather than a time of debauchery. And as I mentioned, in New England, especially New York, Christmas was a time of great public distress because it wasn't a Christian holiday. It was just this more like Halloween. In fact, there were stories of people who would go into rich people's homes and tell them, you have to give me something or we will basically do damage to your home. It's like trick or treat, but at Christmas time. And so the New York Historical Society forms with John Pintard, and they began having St. Nicholas Day dinners. They're all Dutch. They're all going to bring Sinterklaas to New York. His brother-in-law, you may have heard, Washington Irving, began publishing books under his pseudonym, Diedrich Knickerbocker. Anybody heard of the New York Knicks? That's exactly where they get their name from, his pseudonym. And he writes The History of New York, where he makes 25 references to St. Nicholas, claiming that he had done important things for the city. But these were whole cloth fiction, totally make-believe, with the purpose of making Christmas a family-oriented. We formed the police to suppress the violence, and now we're going to turn on a positive note and make Christmas this important holiday. He described how Christmases were observed in England in his book, The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gentleman. These were also entirely fictional. So now, not only is it an American tradition, but look, all the way back in Britain, even though these are Dutch traditions, they're also going to kind of neuter Santa Claus by taking away the little, switch-bearing bad guy. What does Santa Claus do if you're bad now? Just coal. Like, how stupid is... I mean, that's how West Virginia makes their money, right? In 1823, The Night Before Christmas was published. Again, this was a fictional story by another member of the New York Historical Society, a guy named Clement Clark Moore. This is a poem. Clement Clark Moore's dad was an Episcopalian priest or pastor. He was a well-regarded teacher at seminary. He had to publish 'Twas the Night Before Christmas anonymously because he couldn't, as a well-respected Christian, be associated with Christmas. It wasn't until after he died that his family finally revealed that he was the guy who actually wrote the poem. 'Twas the night. Think about how recent this is. 1823. All right. The writing of the New York Historical Society members were the significant movement in America which gave us Santa Claus as we know it. Christmas, as the current British and American holiday, was a social reform movement. It was not a religious holiday. That's how the Grinch stole Christmas. How else was this promoted? I'm going long, I'm sorry. How else was it promoted? Norman Rockefeller's paintings, right, in the New York Post. So there's a couple of really neat ones, family, everybody's excited, toys, bad children, the works. Thomas Nast, 1840 to 1902, a German immigrant, right? Again, promoting the background of Germany. Illustrator for Harper's Weekly. His illustrations of Santa Claus gave us, today, when you think of Santa Claus, you think of something very much like that. That came entirely out of the imagination of Thomas Nast. And Coca-Cola began an advertising campaign in 1931 that really cemented for us the idea. Haddon Sundblom was that illustrator. So this is where our idea and the stories of Santa Claus come from, a Coca-Cola advertising campaign. Thanksgiving Day, 1924. You can't get the retail shops not involved in that, right? So we have, hey, look, Andy the alligator. But what else do they have? It's Macy's Christmas Parade. They had this on Thanksgiving. Why? Because they just opened a 1 million square foot store in New York City. And how do we get people in? Well, we get them to buy gifts for Christmas. And what do we put at the end of our parade but Santa Claus? Right? Aren't we good, wholesome people? Come buy our stuff. All right. By the mid-1800s, Santa and Christmas had become big business. 1890, James Edgar was the first man to dress up as Santa in his department store in Brockton, Massachusetts. Just 20 years earlier, schools were meeting on Christmas Day because it wasn't a holiday. So that is the history of, now when I say Christmas, I don't mean the birth of Christ here. I'm talking about the trappings and the Black Friday and Cyber Monday and all that, right? You all understand that, or you should. So that is questions. I sped through the very end of that because I ran out of time. Yes, ma'am.
If they did not recognize birthdays, how did they keep up with the years?
They kept up with the years by the proconsuls that were appointed to the Roman government, and that's how they named the years. It wasn't until the short guy, Demetrius or whatever his name was, Eusebius, decided to change the calendar in 591. That was then made popular by the Venerable Bede in 731, that would change the years to the date of Christ's birth. But he was off by at least 4 years.
Well, they kept up with birthdays in the Old Testament. How did they know?
The only people who celebrated birthdays in the Old Testament were sinners who killed people on their birthdays.
They kept up with the years.
They kept up with who was born, but not when they were born. We don't know the year. We know who was king, and that's how they track the year. On the first year of the king of somebody, right? On the 7th year, this king, and the first year, that king. So it was, appointment to the kingship. But yeah, birthdays, Adam and Eve didn't even have one. They had a creation moment. Any other questions? I'm just telling you how it was. I'm not trying to say. You should fill it with all of the joy and love of Christ, but don't tell stories.
Do you want to start taking this stuff down today?
No. Thank you.